Hello, I am Mr. McNeil, and this is Symbology Breakdown Kinematics. In these part one, in this series of videos, we're going to be talking about the symbols that are used when it comes to defining certain terms that we've used in kinematics. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, then may I suggest looking at the previous series, which is Vocabulary Breakdown, in which we described all of these terms. And I wouldn't say in lengthy detail, but definitely with a bit of rather concise, but I'd say on point definition of each one of those terms. So the first one we're going to talk about is position. Now, position is actually an easy one to deal with. These are the four terms that we use for position. R is a little bit of an odd one if you think about it, but there are cases where you're just simply trying to get a line from one point to the other, or you're using something like polar coordinates. So R becomes this kind of general term for a position. It also can sometimes mean displacement, which I did not put on there. Oh, yeah, I did. These are what we've seen from the Cartesian coordinate system. We could use the polar coordinate system to determine the location of an object. We can use the bipolar, whatever we need to do to find that location. But typically, over the course of this class, we'll be using the Cartesian, which is x, y, z. Cool. Distance is one that we kind of use on and off. This is a dangerous one because sometimes I will use displacement with a d. I will try my best not to do that, but I'm going to let you know that distance, we're just going to use a lowercase d, and hopefully I don't make mistakes like I've done previously. And just a lowercase d for distance. The next one is displacement. Now, displacement is a little bit different. So for IB, there is a letter that's designated for displacement, and that is S. You will also see that S in AP. Some of the equations that are given in the equation book in AP will use the letter S to represent displacement, but in general, displacement in AP is going to be delta X, delta Y, delta Z, or a large R. Now, the delta means change. So when we looked at position and it was X, Y, Z, delta X is referring to the change in position, which by definition is displacement. And just for our physics class, it's going to be delta X, delta Y, delta Z, or R, just like I said for the AP class. We may, like I say, use S as a stand-in for displacement. Actually, it is an acceptable term for displacement. I'm just letting you know for IB specifically, if it is displacement, it will be an S. AP will use a delta X to describe displacement too. This one's an Let me get to the next one, which is velocity. It's a big The problem with velocity is that there are ways in which they're expressed and they're carrying additional information. But in general, look at that. I put a little at the end of classes. But in general, velocity is going to represent a V. The second velocity is an italicized V. It could also be a V with an arrow above it. There is a couple of equations where we have to delineate the difference between a voltage and a velocity, and you'll just simply put an arrow over the top of it representing a vector velocity. But in general, it's a V. There are a few variants to this, though. And we'll get to those in a second. The next is acceleration. Acceleration will always be a lowercase a. Always will be a lowercase a. Nowhere will we see it expressed any other way. All right, so this is additional notation when it comes to things like position, velocity, and acceleration. We may need to denote the initial position, the beginning position, the starting position, or we may need to represent the final position or the end position. Okay, so we tend to use IF or O, that's a zero, it's a not, to represent initial and final, and I'll give you an example of that in the next slide. So this next slide is talking once again about velocity. So if you look at it, if I wanted to talk about initial velocity, you have initial velocity V, lowercase I. Okay, and that little subscript character just simply means initial velocity. There is also the VO, which represents initial velocity too. Final velocity would be V with an F, or just V in a problem. Sometimes you'll simply be looking for the velocity after 5 seconds. They give you an acceleration, they give you time. Representing that final would just be a v. So you have to be careful when it comes to velocities. Typically, if you see a velocity just as a v, it means final, but it also may have a v final, a v with a little f. Initial velocity usually has something to separate it from any other velocity by either carrying an I or an O. It's a zero, but O sounds cooler. The last little bit here is for IB. So IB does do things a little bit differently. Over the course, you'll see other things that are kind of a little bit different than what you would see in a traditional American kind of physics format. And that is in IB, when we talk about initial velocity, we will be using a U to represent that. Okay, cool. So this is Symbology breakdown for kinematics. It's part 1. There is a part 2 for this. Just kind of a breakdown of what those symbols mean. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to answer them.